right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Dudley Municipal Finance Forum. It's a joint meeting with the Dudley Board of Selectmen and the Dudley Charlton Regional School Committee. Just a matter of usual activities. I'm going to open the Selectmen's meeting.
And we are going to reconvene our school committee meeting.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, we'll call the Abrahams group up to do their presentation. Thank you.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Abrahams, part of the Abrahams Group. Also working on this project, on this presentation, is Mark Abrahams, also of the Abrahams Group, but Mark could not be here tonight. So we are here to talk about the financial outlook for the town of Dudley and Dudley Charlton Regional School District. We've been working with both the town and the school district over the last few months to take a look at finances, to take a look at current finances, and to project out a few years for both the town and the school district. And you'll see the results of that analysis this evening as we go through these slides. Outline. So these are some of the topics we'll be covering tonight during our presentation. Financial data related to Dudley Charlton, the proposed Dudley Charlton assessment to the town of Dudley for FY24, which is the next fiscal year. We're currently in FY23, as well as potential future educational funding for Dudley Charlton, and we'll talk specifically about that in a moment. Proposed town of Dudley expenses for FY24 through FY28. When we were projecting forward, we were looking at 5 years into the future. So we went out to FY28 with those projections. Why an override is needed. I know there are handouts associated with this as well, but we will get into some of the details related to that. What happens if no override? Same thing. There is some information related to that in the handouts that have been given out this evening, but we will cover some of those details as well as a summary, kind of wrapping up all the information that we've learned throughout this process. And included in that summary will be some comparisons to bordering towns. So first slide, we're going to focus on data related to the school district and how the assessments are calculated and how that translates to the towns themselves. I realize as we're looking at this right now that data is probably very small on the screen, and I apologize for that. What it is it's actually a snapshot of information that's provided by the state every year, information that is used to calculate, in this case, Dudley's local required contribution, which is is a step along the way of determining what the assessment is for Dudley each year. And I was planning on talking in detail about this, but I'll go through it relatively quickly because, as you know, you can't see it very well. But on the left-hand side are some calculations to determine what the target contribution is. This is done for every district in Massachusetts. This particular slide that we're looking at is for the town of Dudley. On the top of the left-hand side is EQ. The first section is EQV, and the second section is income. And those two numbers together equal what's called a combined effort yield. And that combined effort yield is a metric that could be used to determine what Dudley's local required contribution is. Another one is 82.5% of the foundation budget as calculated by the state, and whichever is lower ends up being the target for Dudley for the local required contribution. In this case, it's the combined effort yield, so that is based on EQV and income, which are considered wealth factors. On the right-hand side is how Dudley is doing trying to meet that target. And There's some calculations that take place to determine the preliminary contribution. That's up at the top. Start with the prior year's local contribution. It gets inflated by something called the municipal revenue growth factor, which is based on town revenues reported recently to get a preliminary contribution, and then that's compared against the target. And in some cases, if the difference between the preliminary and the target is substantial, there may be an increment that takes place to get the town, to get the local required contribution a little closer to the target. So in summary, Dudley's local required contribution, as I already mentioned, is based on its wealth factors. Dudley is currently below its target by just over 9%. And the way that this calculation works every year is that Dudley will continue to increase its local contribution and maybe have an increment until it reaches its local target. Again, it's the calculation that takes place every year. So the next slide is also to do with Dudley, but this is the required district contribution. So we're taking it one step further, and we're determining what the contribution, Dudley's contribution is to each of the regions, to each of the school districts to which it belongs. And on this slide, which seems like you can probably see this one a little bit better than the last one, you can see Dudley Charlton in the middle there of the three districts. Southern Worcester is the other major one to which Dudley belongs. So the way that the required district contribution is calculated, it's based on foundation shares. Really, it's based on each district's foundation budget, which is on line 7 there, and the shares are determined right below that on line 8, ultimately leading to the required district contribution on line 9. As mentioned in one of the bullet points to the right, Dudley's minimum local contribution to Dudley Charlton is $7.4-ish million. And I don't think I mentioned this yet, but these are FY24 preliminary numbers. The last time we did a presentation like this, we were looking at FY23 numbers, which were known at the time, and we're projecting forward to FY24. Since that presentation, we now have preliminary FY24 numbers available, and that's what is being shown to you this evening. So that required contribution on line 9, which is the bolded number, $7.4 million, that is the starting point for the regional assessment. And there's another calculation that takes place to determine the total assessment, but that is the starting point. And this is the same slide as the first one I showed you, but this is for Charlton, and it's pretty much set up the same way. The target is calculated similarly. It's based on the wealth factors that I mentioned earlier, and Charlton's contribution is also currently below the target, in this case by about 6.5%. And one thing that we wanted to note is that the municipal revenue growth factor, which is the percentage by which the last year's contribution is increased to get the preliminary contribution, is actually higher than we were projecting when we last went through slides similar to these. And that's because of, I believe, a cannabis factor in town for Charlton. We were using a projection at the time that was a little bit lower. So it went from about 3% to 6.74%. We just want everyone to be aware of that. And here's the same slide as shown 2 slides ago for Dudley. This is for Charlton's local required district contributions. Again, trying to determine the required contribution for the districts to which Charlton belongs. Dudley Charlton, again, is the middle column. And the minimum local contribution in this case is $12.7 million. And like I said earlier, this is the starting point for the assessment that's determined for Charlton by the Dudley Charlton region. Chapter 78. The formula-looking graphic on the left is, again, right out of the workbook that's provided by the state every year. These are FY24 numbers. I'm going to go through these bullet points on the right. Dudley Charlton's FY24 base aid, $24.8 million base aid. In this case is the prior year's Chapter 78 total. So we start there, about $12.8 million. When we did a similar analysis to the one that we have worked on about 6 years ago, that number was 24.1 million. So it has increased a little bit since then, but not by a whole lot. Foundation aid, $24.6 million. Because base aid exceeds foundation aid for FY24, Dudley Charlton receives minimum aid. It's an increment of $30 per foundation enrollment, and that works out to be just under $100,000. So another way to put it is that the difference between the number this year, the Chapter 78 number for FY24, and the FY23 number is that minimum aid number of about $100,000. But an important note here is that base aid exceeds foundation aid by about $168,000, and that number is much lower than it was when we looked at this about 6 years ago, when it was $2.6 million. So what that means is Dudley Charlton is trending towards being a foundation aid district, and therefore there is a possibility that Chapter 8 does increase in the near future. But again, just a possibility, and we don't know that at this point. And here is one last slide that's showing some data that's received from the state. This is focusing on net school spending, and it also is a comparative slide showing the 23 numbers, the 24 numbers. Those are the two leftmost columns in the table on the left. And some summary comments. Foundation enrollment declined by 58 students, or 1.7%. That's from FY23 to the next fiscal year of FY24. Foundation budget increased by $2.5 million. That's a 5.9% increase. The required district contributions, which is the total of the two that were mentioned earlier, Dudley and Charlton together, increased by $1.1 million, or 6%. Chapter 78, the number that we just covered on the prior slide, increased by just under $100,000, or about $98,000, which was a 0.4% increase, and obviously is well below the inflation increases that have been seen recently. Required net school spending increased by $1.2 million, or $2.9 million, and actual net school spending remains lower than the statewide average. And we had those numbers. So actual net school spending compared to required is 12% in Dudley Charlton, and we had the statewide average somewhere in the 20% range. Just FYI on that. And kind of a wrap-up slide on the slides that preceded this one. Chapter 70 summary. Dudley Charlton remains a minimum aid district, receiving, in this case, FY24, an increase of about $98,000, just under $100,000, which is 0.4%, well below inflation. Dudley Charlton has been a minimum aid district for many years now, which is the main reason why Chapter 78 hasn't increased by a whole lot during the time period that was mentioned earlier. Dudley Charlton's FY24 Chapter 70 aid, $24.9 million. It was 24.3 when we looked at this a few years ago, FY18, the FY18 number. That's a $600,000 increase over 6 years. With limited additional state aid, increases to meet Dudley Charlton's budget must come from town assessments. So in other words, we're not seeing a whole lot of aid coming from a whole lot of additional aid coming from the state at this point. So in order to fund the Dudley Charlton assessments, that money has to come from somewhere. Minimum aid appears to be the continued pathway for the region. So we've mentioned that that has been the pathway in the recent past. That is the pathway again for FY24, and it could very well be the pathway into the future. But as mentioned a few moments ago, Dudley Charlton is trending towards being a foundation aid district, and that could alter the Chapter 70 aid in the future. Could. We don't know yet. Okay, so now we're going to start transitioning towards starting to look at assessments, looking forward, FY24. Dudley Charlton proposed assessments. Left-hand side, the FY23 assessments are there for you. The Dudley number of about $10 million, the Charlton number of about $15 million. Proposed assessments for FY24, and we'll get into how these were calculated momentarily. Dudley, $13.2-ish million, Charlton, $17.3-ish million. FY24 proposed assessments have been proposed to cover a few things. Additional funding for Dudley Charlton's operating budget, increase of about $3.66 million. And you can see there on the screen a breakdown of what makes up that amount. Contractual obligations being the biggest one, $1.3 million, and there are a few others in there. And also, I believe that information is also available in the handout that you have received this evening. In addition to additional funding for Dudley Charlton's operating budget, funding for feasibility study for a regional high school, $463,000. Additional funding of capital for $1.4 million for Dudley Middle School's roof, as well as other capital projects approved by Dudley voters in September of 2022. And this table shows how the assessments, the FY24 assessment that we showed on the prior screen, how it was calculated, how Dudley's assessment was calculated. And I'll quickly run through this. We started with the FY23 operating assessment number, which is that first number in the leftmost column. That's about it was about $9.8 million, increasing by 2.5%, gets an additional about $250,000. And then in order to fund additional operating needed, there was an increment to that of about $1.3 million. That yields a total operating assessment of the next number on that row of about $11.3 million. One row down, there's $1.9 million. That is the total of the two capital-related numbers I showed you on the prior slide, the $463,000, I think it was, for the feasibility study, plus the additional $1.4 million for capital for the roof, as well as the other projects mentioned. That's the $1.9 million total. You add those two numbers together, you get the $13.2 million that we showed you on the prior slide. Now, going forward, we've also looked in the future into what we think, we'll call them projected assessments, are going to be for Dudley, for the Dudley-Charlton region. As I mentioned earlier, we looked out multiple years, so we went all the way out to FY28 in this case. The top row has operating assessments increasing by, I believe it's a 2.5% going across on that top row. So you start with that 11.3 number. That is the new number for FY24, and you increase it by the 2.5%. If we go down two rows, we're looking at additional operating assessments, but instead of increasing the operating assessment, the plan is to take money out of the additional capital assessment that took place for FY24, $750,000. That leaves $1.15 million, which we'll talk about in a second, where that is. If you add the $750 to the $11.5 million, you get a new assessment for FY25 projected of about $12.3 million. And then as we go outward, we're adding an additional $750,000 on that operating line, the second operating line, to come up with a new assessment each year. And the bottom row shows you the projected total assessments. I already mentioned 12.3 for FY25, up to 13.4 for 26, about 14.5 for 27, and about 15.6 for FY28. This next slide shows introduction of what we're calling the Educational Stabilization Fund. So I already mentioned that that $1.15 million, well, here's where it appears. So the top row in this table are the assessments, the assessments that I just mentioned a moment ago. They're in the bottom row of the prior table I showed you. Those are the projected assessments for the town of Dudley, for Dudley Charlton, over the 5-year period that we've talked about. We talked about how that $750,000 out of the FY24 capital assessment, the plan as of now is to use that for operating in FY25. Well, there's an additional $1.15 million that is tied to that. So what happens there? The plan is to put that, or allocate that as reserves to this Educational Stabilization Fund, FY25, and likewise, FY26, there's also an amount that's planned to go into that stabilization fund of $400,000, And the way that that 400,000 is calculated, it's the 1.9 minus 750,000 twice. So 750 twice is 1.5 million. That's the difference, $400,000. By using the stabilization fund and allocating reserves to it, then reserves can be taken out in subsequent years to help with funding the Dudley Charlton assessments. So the plan as of now is to take $350,000 out of that fund in FY27 to lower the actual funding needed for Dudley Charlton by that amount for the town of Dudley, and a similar concept out in FY28, that amount being 1.1 million. So you can see 28 is probably the easiest way to look at this, but you can see the calculated projected assessment, 15.6 on that top row, with the reserves coming out of the stabilization fund of 1.1 million. The amount of educational funding from taxes for Dudley decreases to 14.5 in that year because that 1.1 is available to supplement. This plan allows for funding of FY24 increases in Dudley Charlton's operating and capital assessments, including one-time capital in 24, which was already talked about. Increases the town's levy capacity, ensuring future Dudley Charlton assessments can be funded. Instead of reducing educational funding in subsequent years, that would be subsequent years to the FY24 bump up that we're talking about. This stabilizes future years by reserving funds to offset future assessments, and it allows for steady increases in education funding for Dudley Charlton, meaning that it's going up typically by a consistent amount rather than more of a roller coaster effect. So now at this portion of the presentation, we're transitioning more to the town of Dudley and focusing on those finances. So a financial outlook for FY24. We've already talked about the Dudley Charlton assessment and how that was calculated for FY24 in order to fund it. And when we say it, we're talking about both operating and capital, the complete assessment. $3.17 million in additional funding is needed. Other town expenses are increasing, and recently available funding from ARPA and the CARES Act has been used and is no longer available to fund the town's annual budgets. With increases to town expenses and recently available funding no longer available, $1.67 million in additional funding is needed to provide and maintain the needed levels of municipal services. This slide also focuses on FY24. These are some of the costs that were identified as increasing. And therefore, I mentioned the 1.67 million on the prior slide. These are some of the things that would fund. And this is other than the Dudley Charlton assessment. So personnel and staffing, specifically focused on a few positions here. Police is a police social worker, which is a new position, 2 firefighters, new positions. Contractual obligations for personnel, cybersecurity, online services, and the like. County retirement went up in FY24 by the amount on the screen, $130,000, which is about a 12% increase. Group insurance likewise went up $200,000, 7% increase, plus we've included the impact of additional insurance for new hires. OPEB up about $10,000. Municipal expenses, $165,000 increase. That includes cap, landfill, energy, regulatory and compliance mandates, and the like, as well as grant and project design of $65,000. This slide has the full financial outlook for the 5 years that we've been looking at for the town of Dudley, and this is all inclusive, so this would include the increased assessments that we've talked about. The top row has revenues and available funds that have been projected for FY24 through 28. The middle row, the expenses projected over that time period, and the difference. And you can see in FY24, there's a difference of just under $5 million, 4.8-ish million dollars, and the differences increase from there. And focusing specifically on FY24, the override amount being sought is that $4.8 million number, and it's broken out into a school portion of about 3.2 million, or 3.17 as I presented on the, not the prior slide, but this one, the slide before that, and the town portion of about $1.6 million make up that 4.8. Speak up. Okay, my apologies. Is that better? Is that better? How about that? Excuse me. Okay, why the override is needed. Tax revenue available from Proposition 2.5 is not enough to keep up with recent inflationary increases in costs, to provide and maintain needed levels of municipal services, to fund larger increases in fixed costs like group insurance, retirement, and other benefits which affect both the town and the school district, to fund needed assessment increases for Dudley Charlton, to fund minimal required expenses associated with large grant applications, and a one-time vote to provide municipal funding and funding of education at functional levels for the foreseeable future. What happens if no override? We have multiple slides on this. This one is focused on the regional school district, Dudley Charlton. Reductions and adjustments for Dudley Charlton, which are presumed to be reductions in staff equal to 31.4 FTEs, which would impact all departments across the district. The depletion of excess and deficiency funds, which is another word for reserves. Impacts to any or all of the following: increased class sizes, athletics, music. And there is a handout that contains information related to this in better detail, more detail. What happens if no override? This is the town of Dudley. This slide is for the town of Dudley. Reductions and adjustments for the town of Dudley presumed to be staffing impact in multiple departments, including the police department, fire department, board of health, highway, treasurer collector, and assessors. Municipal expenses, including regulatory and compliance mandates, and the ability for the town to apply for large grants. And like with Dudley Charlton details, there's information related to this in the handout for the town of Dudley. And some summary slides for you this evening. The town of Dudley has a town budget that is significantly lower than its bordering towns because of lower revenues compared to those towns, as shown in the following table. Dudley is the bottom row in this table. It's highlighted in yellow. But you can see that there are revenue amounts well below those other towns. And the total budget is also well below those other towns. The total budget is the rightmost number. The impact of commercial property taxes is significantly higher in bordering towns, due in large part to the existence of major routes in those towns and Dudley's lack of access to major routes. The town of Dudley is seeking a Proposition 2.5 override in the amount of $4.8 million, broken out as $3.17 million for school assessments to fund Dudley Charlton's operating assessment increases, which were covered earlier. And as mentioned earlier as well, Dudley's portion of a feasibility study to renovate the regional high school, and a significant amount of Dudley Middle School's new roof and other capital projects. The $1.67 million for town operations. The 1.67 is the town portion of the override amount, and it would ensure that the town continues to provide and maintain needed levels of municipal services, that the town can avoid layoffs of staff from multiple departments, that the town can fund required positions across multiple departments, that the town can address regulatory and compliance mandates, that the town can fund minimal required expenses associated with future grant applications. And one more summary slide for you. This is looking at taxes themselves. The town of Dudley has a lower tax rate and a lower average residential tax bill by about $1,000 today when compared to bordering towns as shown in the following table. Again, Dudley is the final row in this table, highlighted in yellow. And you can see that the tax rate is clearly less. And the second to last column is the average single-family tax bill, and it is below, I'd say well below, most of the other towns. And mentioned earlier, it's about $1,000 below on average. With an override, with the override as being proposed, Dudley's residential tax rate would increase $3.34 to $13.50, and its average annual single-family tax bill would increase by about $1,200 to $4,872. And those were all the slides I had for you this evening, so we can move to questions and comments.
So for questions, I think we'll start first by, is there any questions for the Abrahams Group on the analysis of the data up front? If not, we can move to any general questions, and the way it'll work, if it's a municipal question, we'll defer to the correct person to answer the question, whether it's a department head or town administrator. And if it's a school question, we'll work through the superintendent or any of the other school committee members. And so if you want, we're gonna work this through kind of like town meeting. I won't be as good as the moderator. Yeah, yeah. So we're gonna work this through just like town meeting, except for not as good as the town moderator would. I'll try to call on anyone. If you could go to the mic in the center, tell us who you are and then the question. Let's try to keep the questions to the topics at hand. I know there's other things that go on in the world, and let's try to keep it to that.
Hello, my name is Kathy Hurst. I live on Camelot Circle in Dudley. We all know that the law for Prop 2.5 is not to increase a person's tax by more than 2.5%, correct? That's what we're overriding if we pass this?
Yes, that's.
If you override this, Dudley will have their taxes increased by at least 25% or more.
Mr. Town Administrator, do you want to talk about the ins and outs of the 2.5, Prop 2.5?
Mrs. Hurst is absolutely correct. The law requires us to adjust when according to a state formula every year when the tax rate is set. It either requires an adjustment in the tax rate itself in comparison to the value of property, or requires the value of the property and vice versa. The bottom line is that you are correct. It doesn't adjust beyond 2.5% without an override. The law provides the ability for the community to come out and vote for an override in cases where the situation, such as inflation and so forth, the tax rate that 2.5% limit is not adequate to meet the needs of the municipality or the school system in this case.
Any other questions?
Yep, you can go back there.
First I have to ask, can somebody speak from Charlton?
It's a Dudley meeting. I would imagine Charlton would have a meeting.
This is a school committee. It's
Oh,
a
it's also school.
committee.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Stephen Sage, I live in Charlton. When school systems' overall ability to provide a excellent education to their students, when things don't pass, if they don't pass in in Dudley for the override, and Charlton doesn't support the increases that you're asking of our community. Historically, what happens to the value of somebody's home for the possibility of it being sold? Does it go down? So I'm kind of asking, if the quality of education decreases and the value of our community decreases because the education is decreased, because basically a lot of people move into a community based on the high standards of education. I'm assuming that if my house is valued at $300,000, that I immediately lose about 10%, which is about $30,000 of the value of my home. Does anybody have any, the Abrams Group have any historical data on what happens to a community when the educational system deteriorates?
No, we don't have that data available right now.
Does anybody on the Charlton School Committee or the Dudley Town Council?
And anyone care to recommend anyone that would know the answer? No, sir? I don't believe we do.
So I'm just guessing that our values of our homes will decrease, because I know I moved into Charlton because of the education. I know my parents moved into the community I grew up in based on the value of education, not the community other than, you know, what they were providing as services, but the quality of education. So I am concerned that that will happen, and I know that if the quality of education begins to deteriorate in our two communities, I know I will not be able to recommend to individuals that this would be a community that you might want to move into, in either Dudley or Charlton.
Thank you. All right, well, I'm sure the moderator would say, let's try to keep the applause to a minimum.
Hi, Pat Fanning French, Partridge Hill Road. I just have a question for the gentleman who spoke for the Abrams Group. At the very end, I didn't catch what you said. Did you say the annual tax increase would be from $1,205.55 up to $4,872 for a house? No, but that's for the average assessment.
The last thing I said on this slide was related to the average annual single-family tax bill?
Yes. So you're saying somebody's tax bill could go up 4,000?
No, the increase would be $1,200, about $1,200 total.
Correct, for the average home. But if you had a home that was above average, that was assessed for more than 360,000 and whatever the change is.
Then it would go up more than that amount.
Correct. So I guess what I'm asking you, I can't even see it, that $4,872, what was that in reference to?
That is the updated annual average single-family tax bill.
The total?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Robin Watson, Dresser Hill Road in Dudley. I have a few questions. I listened to the recent meetings from the selectmen and the FAA, and I heard a comment made by, I think it was our assessor, that her current assessments may change because recent home sales have increased by $100,000 to $180,000 over the assessment value. As part of this override, does she intend to reassess homes as well?
Mr. Town Administrator, you direct the question.
I don't think she plans to specifically, if the override passes, do anything differently than she would do any other year. But as we all know, home values are going up, and have gone up, and that's reflected in the percentage that you're taxed on.
Okay. And the next question was for the gentleman who spoke first. I see that we have a feasibility study for Shepherd Hill renovation, and I think the cost was about $463,000. Why is that necessary, and what are the plans to renovate the school?
I'm going to direct that to Superintendent Lamarche.
Okay.
Thank you for the question. The district has worked with the Mass School Building Authority, and this building has not been changed since it was first opened in the early 70s, and we've been filing for 14 years to try to look for updates. There is it's a grant program and a reimbursement program, so the $463,000 for the community of Dudley, there would be some reimbursement rate on that would come back on the assessment in future years as well. But it's to look at this building. It's a cost share between Dudley and Charlton to look at this particular building for updates and renovations, or possibly new build. But there is a school building committee set up, and that's what they took a vote. It's the community representatives on that, but that's to fund that feasibility study, which could take, the feasibility study funding is required by Mass School Building Authority by June of this year, but the study itself could take up to 2 years to complete.
Okay. And my last question was, I also noticed from the gentleman who spoke first, but maybe Board of Education can answer this, we're paying $665,000 a year for out-of-school students. How many students does that add up to?
It's a great question. I don't have the exact number of how many out-of-district students we have, but what's really driving that is the Office of Operational Services Division for the state of Massachusetts increased our tuitions for those students by 14%. So that's what's really driving that number. That's an automatic $400,000 increase for the number of students. And those are students with significant needs that we as a community support. If we are not able to meet their needs within our public schools, we look for specialized programs for those particular students, and those can be very costly.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Sir?
John Cunningham, West Main Street. In September, we voted a debt exclusion for the schools of $7.5 million, and that included new roofs, some security, and a architectural review. I'm just wondering why this $3.1 million for the schools, say, they're talking about a roof again, and of course, this $400,000 feasibility study.
If I'm not accurate, please correct me, but in September, you voted for the capital plan for the capital improvements. You did not vote on the funding mechanism for that. So you didn't vote on the actual funding exclusion part of that. You just voted for the capital plan to move forward with a new roof at Dudley Middle School as well as other capital improvements for the district. So that's why it's in this part of this, because you didn't vote on the funding mechanism for it.
Any other questions? Sir?
Hi, my name is Mike. I live on Tracy Road. My question is, with the cost of inflation and everything, we're all feeling it. An increase like this is obviously something we're all going to notice, but my question is this kind of a one-time only thing, or is this something we're going to run into in 2025 or 2024? Something that we're going to see, every year, we're going to see our taxes go up even more, or is this kind of like one and done kind of thing?
So, Town Administrator, you want to take that?
It's a great question, and on average, our taxes go up at least 2.5%, we know for certain every year. Since we passed the last override, they've gone up about 12% or 2.4%, which is, and of course, as everyone knows, inflation has greatly outpaced that 2.4% minimum. So to answer your question, it's almost a guarantee that your taxes will continue to go up. We predict as far into the future as we think is wise to do. There's no plan to go for another override in '28. We have to see where we are when we get closer to that. But this plan provides for the needed funding for both the school assessment and the municipal side of government.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions? All right, last call for questions. Okay. Thank you all for coming. Can I get a motion to adjourn the Board of Selectmen meeting?
Make a motion to adjourn the Board of Selectmen meeting. Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Unanimous.
I'll make a motion. Can I have a motion to adjourn the school committee meeting?
I'll make a motion to adjourn the school committee meeting.
Second. All those in favor? Opposed? We're adjourned. Thank you all.